What is going on, Headliner Nation? Welcome to the Week 8 Waiver Wire Show. Today we are going to be covering everything that you need to know entering Week 8 of fantasy football. And this week, a lot of people are referring to it as Bye-mageddon. We have 6 teams on a bye, and with so many players injured, it's absolutely gonna suck. But let me tell you what all we're gonna be covering here in today's show. We're gonna start off by going through some of the players who got injured in Week 7, the top injuries in Week 7. Then we'll go through those 6 teams that are gonna be on a bye in Week 8. We'll discuss some studs who sucked in Week 7. We'll talk about the best players available currently on the waiver wire, some waiver wire power rankings. We'll play starter stash, some FAAB budget recommendations, Streamin Ds, and then yes, to end the show, a few players that we can consider dropping in fantasy football. Now, there are timestamps to all of these different sections down below in the description, and if you like that, do me a favor and hit the like button if you haven't already, because I'm pumped. We once again hit our creator pack over on Underdog. The touchdown ticket I posted in Friday's video, it hit, and so far 10 of the 11 picks that I've posted here on YouTube have hit as well. If AJ Barner can get 26 yards receiving tonight, that will make us 11 out of 12 for the week here on YouTube, and thousands upon thousands and thousands of people have ended up at least doubling their money, and I absolutely love seeing that. Now, I'll be doing that show once again on Friday. I'll post a video with my picks of the week. Be sure to check it out, and be sure to be all signed up on Underdog so you can come play along with us. All you gotta do is head over to Underdog Fantasy, download the app, create a new account using the referral code Headliners when you do so. Then all you gotta do is make your minimum $10 deposit. You'll get all the promos that they're gonna be offering to you here in Week 8, and then once you play your first $5, they're giving you $100 in bonus funds. Play 5, get 100. It's absolutely a no-brainer, and we're having a lot of fun doing it. Now, I'll put links to everything right there at the top of the description so you can easily find it, but now let's dive into Week 8 and first discuss some of the major injuries we saw in Week 7. Now, overall, it wasn't a horrible week for injuries. We know that Jaden Daniels suffered a hamstring injury. He could be looking at a multi-week absence, which means Marcus Mariota probably taking over the quarterback duties once again in Washington. How about Darren Waller with a pec injury, more than likely going to miss at least, at minimum, 1 week. Then we had Brian Thomas Jr. suffering a shoulder injury. He's about to be on bye this week. We weren't going to have him anyway. Hopefully he can come back after the bye. We're really awaiting the results of some tests there to find out what's really going on with Brian Thomas Jr. Then we had Kendre Miller of the New Orleans Saints. He suffered a knee injury. Reports are saying that he could miss extended time. We may not have him the rest of the fantasy season. We'll talk about what happens with that backfield now later on in this show. And then Michael Penix, he suffered an ankle injury. Now, a lot of people not overly reliant on Michael Penix for their fantasy football team, but this is definitely something that affected him the last drive of the game on Sunday Night Football. He couldn't get anything behind his passes. His arm strength just was not there, and that could hurt other guys like Drake London in our fantasy team. Now, on top of that, we also had Bryce Young suffering a high ankle sprain. Not that that hurts our fantasy teams, but yet another quarterback that it could really determine what happens to one of his wide receivers in Tet McMillan. Now, Andy Dalton is a seasoned vet, and I'm pretty sure he's going to continue to feed the rookie. But it is worth noting that there will be a quarterback change more than likely for the next few weeks in Carolina. But for the most part, that's all we're really looking at for Week 7. It could have definitely been a lot worse. Now let's move in to some players who sucked last week for our fantasy teams. Let's start off with DK Metcalf. He only scored 6.5 fantasy points. My level of concern, somewhere right in that medium range. Different wide receiver, but still the same issue in Pittsburgh. We saw this exact thing with George Pickens the last couple years. A lot of people wanted to blame his attitude, George Pickens that is, and really, that's not it. The problem right now is Arthur Smith. It's really hard for DK Metcalf to do a lot each and every week when he's seen so few targets. Because I'm sorry, there is in no way that if I coached a team or called plays, I would have Jonnu Smith or Pat Freiermuth out targeting DK Metcalf. Now, luckily, he's been propped up by touchdowns here for a majority of the season, but when he doesn't get them, just like we saw in week 7, it kills you. How about Kyren Williams? He only scored 7.5 fantasy points, not overly concerned here. People will look at the box score and just see that Blake Corum had 12 carries and they're going to freak the F out. Now, he got that because they were up by like 30 points. The bigger issue was the Jags could not stop Davante Adams from the 1-yard line, and all the goal line carries that used to go towards Kyren Williams went to the passing game and Davante Adams in week 7. Now, after him, we had Travis Etienne. He only scored 6 fantasy points and really not a whole lot he could do. When they're down by 4+ scores, they're not going to be running the football on the ground. Rome Odunze, he had 4.1 fantasy points, not overly concerned there either. The weather wasn't great in that game, and the running game of the Chicago Bears could not be stopped. Odunze still led the team in targets, and they're not overly committing to DJ Moore or anyone else. I still love me some Rome Odunze the rest of season. Then Ted McMillan, only 4.8 fantasy points. Apparently, Xavier Legette is the wide receiver of choice in week 7, but a lot of that had to do with Sauce Gardner being over on Ted McMillan. It was a tough matchup. I know we're probably going to have Andy Dalton for a couple weeks, but I'm not overly concerned just yet about McMillan. Then we had Breece Hall. He scored 6.2 fantasy points. Really, benching Justin Fields could boost the overall production of Breece Hall because it could lead to more touchdown upside in this offense. However, the key word there is could. It's still the Jets, and they're still the worst team in football. Now, after him is Saquon Barkley. He scored 4.7 points, and obviously, there's a lot of concerns surrounding Saquon Barkley. What's weird, though, is when he touches the football, he doesn't look bad. He still looks explosive. He just can't seem to break a big play on the ground here this entire season. Then we had his teammate Dallas Dare or Goddard, if you're just not feeling fancy on a Monday. He only scored 3.3 fantasy points, and we've seen this in the past. When they make an effort to really force feed the ball to A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith, Dallas Goddard is kind of like the third wheel in this offense, and he kind of loses a lot of opportunity. Now, am I going to say this is how it's going to be rest of season? No, but there is a little bit of panic there considering the fact that they're really trying to focus on getting A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith the ball more deeper down the field. Then we had Ashton Genty going up against Kansas City. He only scored 3.9 fantasy points, not overly concerned. That was a matchup against one of the best run defenses in the NFL, and the team lost by 31 points. It's not like they can really commit to the run when they're down by more than 30. Then Travis Kelce, he only scored 6.9 fantasy points. My level of concern, pretty high, and we've talked about this here for the last few weeks. With all the wide receivers finally healthy and on the field for Kansas City, Travis Kelce is going to take the biggest hit on a weekly basis. He's just not overly needed in that offense right now, so his target share is definitely going to drop with Rashee Rice coming back. He may start trending down here if everyone stays healthy. Then Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt, only 3.7 points, and so many people had high expectations for him in week 7. My level of concern has jumped for sure. He now has back-to-back games where he has dominated the backfield touches, and he has absolutely crapped the bed. And I'm talking like full-on little baby diarrhea type crap the bed. He finally got the opportunity that so many people wanted him to get, and he really hasn't capitalized on it. Now with no Jaden Daniels, you have to think with Marcus Mariota and the other injuries in this offense, it's going to affect them overall and create less scoring opportunities. Then we get Marvin Harrison Jr. in Arizona, 6.8 fantasy points last week. A little bit concerned here. He still led all wide receivers in targets, but everything is just a 50-50 ball down the sideline from Jacoby Brissett. I know a ton of people hate Kyler Murray, but Kyler Murray coming back would definitely help out Marvin Harrison Jr. We saw them finally start to get on the same page pre-Kyler injury. Would love to see that return down the stretch. Then we had J.K. Dobbins at 8.5 fantasy points. Denver just fell behind so early. They could not run the ball consistently. He still averaged almost 6 yards per carry though, so I'm not concerned. And then Drake London, 6.2 fantasy points. Not overly concerned here yet either. Depending on the health of Michael Penix, we just need to give some credit to that San Francisco defense. They played great at home. A lot of people had written them off after the injury to Fred Warner. They still looked great. I mean, Penix had no time in the pocket to find Drake London down the field. But now let's go ahead and move on to those teams that are on bye in Week 8. Like I mentioned earlier, we have 6 teams this week currently on a bye. Now, the first one is full of fantasy assets. It's the Detroit Lions. Jared Goff, Jahmyr Gibbs, David Montgomery, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jamison Williams, and Sam Laporta will not help your fantasy team in Week 8. For the Las Vegas Raiders, they're on a bye as well. Really, the only name we're looking at here is Ashton Genty, but hopefully after the bye, we get Brock Bowers back. The Rams, they're also on a bye. Matthew Stafford, Kyron Williams, Devontae Adams, and another week of no Puka Nacua. Hopefully he returns after the bye week. Then the Arizona Cardinals, no Trey McBride, no Marvin Harrison Jr. The Seattle Seahawks on a bye as well. Sam Darnold, Kenneth Walker, JSN, AJ Barner, they will not be available for your fantasy team in Week 8. And then lastly, the Jacksonville Jaguars. Travis Etienne, Brian Thomas Jr., and Travis Hunter will not be playing football this week in fantasy. So what do? Well, we got to go find out what's on the waiver wire. Full disclosure, there's not a whole lot. With all the injuries we're currently going through and the teams on bye, the waiver wire is looking super thin. Now, a lot of you may be watching the show and be like, what does he know about super thin? Easy. Well, this is a judgment-free zone, okay? But let's go ahead and start off at the quarterback position where we got old reliables here, 1 and 2 at the top. We got Aaron Rodgers first with a matchup going up against the Green Bay Packers. He's got a home game against his former team in Green Bay, a team in which he played for 18 years. And now he has seemed to find the fountain of youth over the last couple weeks, where he has 6 touchdowns over his last 2 games. He is now all the way up to the quarterback 14 overall on the season. He's only owned in 23% of leagues, and even though the matchup on paper isn't great, you definitely know that Aaron Rodgers is going to want to try to do whatever he can to stick it to the Green Bay Packers this week. Now, after him, we got another old reliable in Joe Flacco of the Cincinnati Bengals, only 11% owned with a matchup going up against the Jets. And speaking of the fountain of youth, Joe Flacco has given this Cincinnati offense life. He has 5 touchdowns in 2 games, and he's thrown the ball at least 45 times in each game. Now he gets a matchup going up against this Jets defense, and Sauce Gardner is currently in concussion protocol and may not play this week. Given the fact we've seen Joe Flacco target Jamar Chase like 806 times, and he still has guys like T. Higgins as well in the offense, he could definitely put up some big numbers once again if you're looking for a streaming option. And then lastly, Jackson Dart. I'm still including him. Why is he only 43% owned? I feel like a lot of people look at Jackson Dart and they kind of just think it's a fluke. And then it happens again, and it's still a fluke. Well, we'll see if it happens again. And then it happens again, and people still think it's a fluke. But he has finished top 12 at the position in 3 of the last 4 games he's played, and now he gets a matchup going up against Philly, who he just faced in Week 6 a couple weeks ago, and that week he finished as the QB3 overall. He's available right now in 57% of leagues, and if he's out there and you need a quarterback, I am snatching him up. Now, at the running back position, we have a couple options here. First one up is Brashard Smith of the Kansas City Chiefs. He's only 6% owned with a matchup going up against Washington. And we have mentioned this kid for multiple weeks on this show as a bench stash. And then we kind of saw why in Week 7. He had a season-high 19 touches, but the game was an absolute blowout, so that definitely does matter. However, you have to look at it like this. Kansas City is trying to get this young kid acclimated into the offense. And now, this offense is one of the best overall offenses in the NFL. If he were to take this role and increase it down the stretch, all that touchdown opportunity in the Kansas City offense could fall into his lap. He by far looks better on tape than Kareem Hunt or Isaiah Pacheco. So you have to think if he gets more volume, he could be useful down the stretch of our fantasy football season. Then we have Devin Neal, another rookie in New Orleans. He's currently 0% owned in redraft leagues with a matchup going up against Tampa Bay. And I know we talked about the Kendre Miller injury earlier. We've also seen that Alvin Kamara has not been the most efficient running back on the ground, which means we could be in line for a lot more Devin Neal each and every week. He could acquire some of that early down work. The problem here is it's not an overly high ceiling in this offense. The Saints, they're always losing. They're not really dedicating themselves to running the football on the ground and there's not a whole lot of touchdowns to go around either. But given the overall landscape of fantasy football, he's definitely worth adding in week 8. Then we have Kyle Monangai of the Chicago Bears. He's 6% owned. They have a matchup upcoming against the Baltimore Ravens. He just had a season high with 15 touches, but we got to admit, the weather wasn't great. They had a big time lead, and DeAndre Swift came into that game questionable. He was less than 100% healthy. Now, is Monangai a solid stash in this offense? Abso-freaking-lutely. But when it comes to immediate value, are we wanting to throw him into our lineups in week 8? Probably not. We'll talk about that here in a few minutes. But outside of that, there's not a lot of help at the running back position. So let's move on to the wide receivers now. The first one up, Xavier Legette of the Carolina Panthers. He's 18% owned with a matchup going up against Buffalo. He's coming off one of the best games of his young career. So a lot of people are wondering what to do with him going forward. And honestly, I'm not overly excited about any type of consistency. We got to remember that Ted McMillan had Sauce Gardner on him, and now Bryce Young is dealing with an ankle injury. There's a lot of other options in this offense as well. We know about Chuba Hubbard and Rico Dowdle in the backfield. Aside from Ted McMillan, you also got Jimmy Horn, and Jalen Coker is getting ramped up as well. Now, I definitely think he has the chance to pop off time and again, but is he somebody that we want to consistently throw in our lineup? Probably not at this point. How about Kayshon Boutte? That booty be rocking everywhere once again, and he may be on pace. I think he is. For the most weeks ever in a waiver wire show for a season. The problem with Kayshon Boutte is consistency. He'll have an absolute huge game and then just disappear for a couple weeks. This offense in New England is so good, they're able to spread the ball around to different members of that offense each and every week. Now, he has shown a little bit more consistency here as of late, but he is super reliant on the deep ball. Now, thankfully, Drake May is delivering the cleanest deep balls in the NFL as of right now. But when I look at Boutte, I'm really looking at matchup-based potential, and a matchup this week going up against Cleveland, at least we can say they're going to have to throw because they probably won't be able to run very much against them. Then we have Parker Washington in Jacksonville, only 2% owned, and yes, he's going to be on a bye. But he continues to be a bigger part of this offense than a lot of people, myself included, really want to admit. He just had a game with 10 targets and 3 carries on the ground. Now we know that Brian Thomas Jr. is banged up, so these targets, they could continue. Now, obviously, if BTJ were to miss extended time, Parker Washington could have immediate value. However, given the fact that we don't know exactly what's going to happen to Brian Thomas Jr. here in the near future, and that they're on a bye, this is more of a preliminary ad. Then we have Chimere DK of the Tennessee Titans. He's only 2% owned with a matchup going up against Indianapolis. He just had his best game of the season. 4 catches, 70 yards, and a touchdown. 38 of those yards came on 1 big catch. But we do know that he has that big playability. But what we don't know is the future availability of Calvin Ridley. If Ridley returns and Alec Ao slides back into that wide receiver 2 spot, we probably don't see a whole lot of DK on a weekly basis. Now, after him, we got Alec Pierce of the Indianapolis Colts, only 5% owned going up against Tennessee, and with no Josh Downs in week 7, we saw a ton of Alec Pierce. 10 targets for 5 receptions and 98 yards. Now, if Josh Downs returns, you have to think that this volume decreases. However, Alec Pierce, still one of those big play type of guys in this offense. He does need a touchdown really to be fantasy startable. Maybe those come down the stretch, but it's not something we can overly rely upon. Now, after that, we move down to the tight end position. Harold Fannin Jr. is still 58% owned. Yes, he's over that 50% owned spot that I really look for, but go out there and take a look and just see if he's available. It can't hurt. Now, the Fannin breakout that was supposed to happen in week 7 was kind of thwarted by weather and the fact that Miami sucks so bad they were getting blown out by the Cleveland Browns. They didn't have to throw the ball that much to beat Miami. Now, we do know that David Njoku still won't be 100% healthy in week 8, so Harold Fannin Jr. should have a slight role once again this week. Then we have Oronde Gadsden of the Los Angeles Chargers, only 2% owned, going up against Minnesota. And this is another guy we have talked about on this show for multiple weeks. He's kind of struggled with consistency, but it's starting to come along here the last 2 weeks. And I say that because even with Quentin Johnston returning in week 7, we still saw Gadsden go out and get 8 targets, 7 catches, 164 yards, and a touchdown. He now has 8+ targets in back-to-back games. Now, can we throw him in our lineup and expect a $164 a week? No, absolutely not. But if you're in need for a tight end, and there's one available that's getting anywhere near 8 targets a game, he's probably a good streaming option for your team. Now, it is worth noting they have a matchup this week going up against Minnesota, who did shut down Dallas Goedert of Philadelphia last week. Or did they not shut down Goddard and Philadelphia just forced the ball down the field a little bit more? That right there is also a possibility. And then lastly, I'll mention Pat Freiermuth because a lot of people are going to ask questions about him. He's only 7% owned. They're going up against Green Bay. He had only 8 total catches on the season coming into week 7. Then he had 6 targets, 5 catches, 111 yards, and 2 touchdowns in week 7 alone. A big 68-yard touchdown play was a huge boost to his overall number. But we also know that Aaron Rodgers is really using his tight ends this year in Pittsburgh. The problem with that is there's multiple tight ends. We still have Jonnu Smith, Darnell Washington, and yes, Pat Freiermuth as well. The targets are going to be sporadic. So if he doesn't rack up a couple big plays, he probably kills your fantasy team. But all right, let's go ahead and rank these guys. How would we acquire them off the waiver wire? Now, like I always do, quarterbacks and tight ends are on the bottom of the list. Now, that does not mean they have the least amount of value. That just means that not all teams need quarterbacks and tight ends, where most teams need running backs and wide receivers. Now, if you find yourself needing a quarterback or a tight end, I do have them ranked by their position here in this list. But at the top, I'm going with Brashard Smith of the Kansas City Chiefs. Like I mentioned earlier, if he can develop any kind of role as we go into the second half of this season, his touchdown upside could be ginormous in that offense. Then Devin Neal. We're trying to find touches. Devin Neal is in line for those touches. Then Kyle Monangai. And as great as it was to see him get that opportunity in week 7, it's not an opportunity I expect him to have each and every week unless something were to happen to DeAndre Swift. Then we go down to Kayshon Boutte. He's 30% owned. If you're looking for a plug-and-play wide receiver, at least he's scoring touchdowns right now. Then we have Xavier Legette, followed by Chimere Dike, Alec Pierce, Parker Washington there to round out the wide receiver group, really just because he's on bye this week and he can't immediately help you, which is kind of a good thing. You may be able to get him for a little bit less because he can't help a team immediately. Now, if you're looking for a quarterback, I'm going Jackson Dart, then Joe Flacco and Aaron Rodgers, even though Flacco and Rodgers super close this week. Then at the tight end position, we got Harold Fannin just due to volume alone, and then Oronde Gadsden. I would love to put him as the top available tight end, but with Quentin Johnston and Keenan Allen and Ladd McConkey, there's just so many ways for him to lose targets each game. And then lastly, Pat Freiermuth. I loved what he did in week 7. You know we're a fan of the Muth, but I really don't see that happening all that often. So when we're talking about these guys and whether we should start them or stash them, honestly, in a perfect world, I would love to just stash these guys this week. But I'm also a realist. I know there's a lot of teams out there that are on bye. There's a lot of injuries out there. So as you can see, I've put stash next to everyone other than the quarterbacks and tight ends. If we're recommending them, it's to be a streaming option. Now, if I had to start 2 of these guys this upcoming week, it would be Brashard Smith and it would be Kayshon Boutte. But I do not love that. They may not even be guys that sneak into the top 30 of the rankings, but if you're in desperation mode, those are the top 2 guys, one from each position, that I would be looking at acquiring this week. Now, how much do we want to spend on those guys is a completely different question. And with the way the waiver wire looks right now, I'm not dumping a fat bag on anyone. Now, for Brashard Smith, I'll drop up to 25% of my remaining FAAB budget, and that is pretty risky if I'm being honest. I'm just hoping to capitalize on a potential role late in the season. For Devin Neal, Kyle Monangai, up to 15% at the most for them. Then we get down to Kayshon Boutte and the wide receivers. Honestly, I don't think any of these guys are like game breakers for your fantasy team, so I'm not going to overspend. Less than 10% is where I'm looking at there. At the quarterback position, I'll go up to 20 for Jackson Dart, just because how high of a ceiling he does have. Joe Flacco, Aaron Rodgers, I'll take the cheaper of the 2, hopefully less than 10% for either. And then at the tight end position, Harold Fannin, Oronde Gadsden, I'll go up to 10% or so, maybe a little bit higher if you are absolutely tight end desperate. But as for Pat Freiermuth, I think it was kind of a fluke, so I'm going less than 5%. Now, if you find yourself needing a Streamin D here in week 8, we got the Falcons, Colts, and Chiefs. For the Falcons, solid overall defense for sure, but they're going up against Miami. And that should be enough said right there. The Miami offense has looked horrendous for multiple weeks. The Colts, they're going up against Tennessee, one of the worst overall offenses in the NFL, and Cam Ward just doesn't look great right now. And then the Chiefs, they're going up against Washington, who could be without Jaden Daniels, Terry McLaurin, and Deebo Samuel. Now, unfortunately, with so many other teams on bye, there's not going to be a lot of great options on the waiver wire when it comes to streaming defenses. But okay, this takes us to the most controversial part of this show every time we include it, and it's players that we can potentially drop. Now, I do want to preface this section. This is not a clear, black and white statement. Some of these guys I'm not going to drop for some waiver wire garbage. But maybe you have somebody available out there, maybe even someone we didn't discuss in today's show that has added value. Maybe they've provided some consistent production. That's when we really consider dropping a couple of these guys. Now, the first one up is DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. Obviously, he is an afterthought in this offense. Rome Odunze is the clear number one. They're involving their tight ends more and more. The running game is starting to get going as well. And Luther Burden, when he gets targets, he produces. Now, DJ Moore has been a huge disappointment, and he hasn't really been fantasy startable for weeks. If you have a better option, I can't give you a great enough argument to keep him. Then we have Alec Eomanor of the Tennessee Titans. With DK starting to turn things on, we really don't know about the status of Calvin Ridley going forward, and in an offense that just cannot score touchdowns, if there's a better option, it's not worth holding on to him at this point. Then the big one that a lot of people really don't know what to do, and it's Travion Henderson of the New England Patriots. The dude is over 85% owned. I want him to be a thing. 85% of people who play fantasy football want him to be a thing. He is just not a thing right now in New England. We talked all offseason on how Ramondre Stevenson was going to have a role. Now, as much as we thought that Stevenson was going to have a role, it's even exceeded the expectations that we had. Even after fumbles, they're committing more volume to him, and Travion Henderson is having a hard time even stepping on the football field. Now, I do not want to drop Henderson for nothing, because let me tell you this. If Ramondre Stevenson were to get hurt, Travion Henderson wins fantasy championships in 2025. If you can afford to hold him and stash him, I still do that. If you are in desperation mode due to injuries or bye weeks at the running back position, he's just another guy that I can't really provide an argument for keeping him. But it's gotta be for somebody that is at least gonna get you some fantasy points. I really hope people don't just look at the graphics here and see DJ Moore and Travion Henderson, like they don't listen to what's being said, because that is very important. We're only dropping these guys if we can get some type of production in return. Then we had Ryan Flournoy with CeeDee Lamb back and healthy, and George Pickens still making ridiculous catches, and Jake Ferguson as well. Flournoy is going to be an afterthought unless anyone else goes down in Dallas once again. And then lastly, at the tight end position is Jake Tonjes. Even with George Kittle coming off the IR and still being somewhat limited, Tonjes couldn't do anything in the game. He wasn't involved at all in week 7. You have to think that Kittle only gets more, and this wide receiver group only gets healthier, which means Jake Tonjes isn't going to be fantasy usable until George Kittle goes down. Again, hopefully not though. But all right, there you have your waiver wire show for week 8. It's going to be a tough week for a lot of people in fantasy football, no doubt. But do not go out there and make some stupid mistake that puts your team in jeopardy of losing future matchups down the road, all because you're trying to win just this week. Because like I've said numerous times all season long, this is the year where a team that is below 500 in fantasy football sneaks in to the fantasy playoffs. And once you enter the fantasy playoffs, it doesn't matter what your record is. It matters how well your team is performing at that time.